The Indiana Fever had just suffered another devastating blow, but this time it wasn't just about basketball. Sophie Cunningham lay on the court writhing in agony, her season officially over with a torn MCL. But what happened next would ignite a firestorm that exposed the dark underbelly of the WNBA that nobody wants to talk about. It started with one photo. Just one single frame captured by the cameras that would send shockwaves through the entire basketball world. While Sophie Cunningham was lying on the floor in excruciating pain, clutching her knee after what many are calling a vicious and intentional collision with Bria Hartley, something caught everyone's attention. Hartley was smiling. Not just a subtle grin, but a full-blown smile as Sophie's season came to a brutal end right in front of her eyes. The internet absolutely lost its mind. Within minutes, that image was spreading like wildfire across every social media platform. Fans were demanding answers, calling for investigations, and questioning how any human being could smile while watching another person suffer such a devastating injury. The comment section turned into a war zone, with thousands of people calling Hartley a dirty player and demanding the WNBA take immediate action. But here's where it gets really twisted. The referees who are supposed to protect these athletes did absolutely nothing. No flagrant foul call, no review of the play, no immediate action whatsoever. They just let the game continue as if Sophie's season-ending injury was just another routine basketball play. The silence from the officials was deafening, and it sent a clear message that player safety wasn't their priority. This wasn't just some freak accident either. Anyone who watched the replay could see exactly what happened. Hartley launched herself directly into Sophie's knee with what looked like deliberate intent to cause harm. The collision was so brutal that you could hear Sophie's scream of pain echoing through the arena. Yet the league that claims to care about player welfare turned a blind eye to what was happening right in front of them. Sophie Cunningham had already been dealing with injuries all season long. She'd been battling through ankle problems, wearing braces just to stay on the court, and fighting to help her team succeed. She was one of the few players who had consistently stood up for Caitlin Clark when others wouldn't, showing the kind of loyalty and toughness that made her a fan favorite. Now, in one vicious moment, all of that was taken away from her. The timing couldn't have been worse for Indiana. With Caitlin Clark already sidelined and multiple other key players out with injuries, Sophie was one of the last remaining stars holding the team together. She was their shooter, their energy, their heart and soul on the court. Without her toughness and leadership, the Fever's playoff hopes were hanging by a thread. But what really had fans absolutely furious wasn't just the injury itself, it was the pattern they'd been witnessing all season long. Dangerous plays going uncalled, referees letting obvious fouls slide, and players getting hurt because the league refused to enforce basic safety standards. Sophie's injury was just the latest example of a system that was completely broken and putting athletes at risk every single game. Social media exploded with outrage as fans connected the dots. They started posting compilation videos of other questionable plays that had gone unpunished, pointing out how the same referees who ignored this dangerous collision were quick to call technical fouls for much smaller infractions. The hypocrisy was so obvious that even casual basketball fans were starting to notice something was seriously wrong with WNBA officiating. The most disturbing part was how predictable this whole situation had become. Fans had been warning about these kinds of incidents for months, pointing out that the league's lenient approach to dangerous plays would eventually cost someone their career. Now their worst fears had come true, and Sophie Cunningham was paying the price for the WNBA's negligence. As news of the MCL tear spread throughout the basketball world, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't just another injury report or routine setback. This was a defining moment that would test whether the WNBA actually cared about protecting its players or if they were more concerned with avoiding controversy and maintaining their image. The answer would shock everyone, but not in the way anyone expected. What most people didn't know was that Sophie Cunningham had been fighting this battle against the WNBA long before her injury ever happened. She'd become enemy number one to league officials, and the reason why will blow your mind. Sophie had committed the ultimate sin in their eyes. She told the truth about their incompetence. Just months before her career-threatening injury, Sophie was slapped with her third fine from the WNBA for daring to speak out about referee incompetence on her podcast. The league hit her with a $1,500 penalty for simply calling out officials who were making game-changing mistakes. But here's the kicker: while they were quick to punish Sophie for using her voice, they completely ignored the dangerous plays that were putting players at risk every single night. The hypocrisy was absolutely mind-blowing. Sophie would get fined hundreds of dollars for saying referees made bad calls, but those same referees could let a player get seriously injured and face zero consequences. The message from the WNBA was crystal clear: shut up, play basketball, and don't you dare question our authority, even when lives and careers are on the line. Sophie's first fine came after she criticized officials for their inconsistent whistles during a particularly brutal game. She pointed out how certain players were getting superstar treatment while others, like herself, were getting hammered with no calls. The league's response? A $500 fine and a stern warning to keep her mouth shut. But Sophie wasn't the type to back down from a fight. Her second fine was even more ridiculous. Sophie had called out the officials for missing obvious fouls that could have resulted in serious injuries. She wasn't being disrespectful or crossing any lines. She was literally trying to protect herself and her fellow players from getting hurt. The WNBA's answer was another fine and more threats about her behavior. By the time Sophie received her third fine, the pattern was undeniable. The league had turned her into a target for having the audacity to demand better officiating. Every podcast appearance, every social media post, every interview was being monitored by league officials looking for any reason to punish her further. They were trying to make an example out of her to intimidate other players into staying silent. But what made this whole situation even more infuriating was the timing. Sophie was getting fined for predicting exactly what would happen to her. She'd been warning for months that the referee's negligence would lead to serious injuries, and the WNBA's response was to punish her for speaking up. Then, when her worst fears came true and she suffered a season-ending injury due to a play that should have been flagged, the same officials who'd been fining her did absolutely nothing to protect her. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious. Sophie gets fined $1,500 for criticizing referees on a podcast, but Bria Hartley faces zero consequences for a collision that ended someone's season. The league had plenty of money to collect from players who spoke out, but somehow couldn't find the resources to properly train their officials or enforce basic safety standards.
Other players started to take notice of what was happening to Sophie. They saw how the league was systematically targeting anyone who dared to question the status quo. The message was being sent loud and clear: if you speak up about problems in the WNBA, you'll be punished financially and potentially blacklisted from opportunities.
Sophie's fines weren't just about money, they were about control. The WNBA was trying to silence one of their most vocal critics by hitting her where it hurt most. For a player who wasn't making superstar money, these fines represented a significant financial burden. But more importantly, they were trying to destroy her reputation and turn other players against her. What the league didn't count on was Sophie's refusal to be intimidated. Each fine only made her more determined to expose the truth about what was really happening behind the scenes. She kept speaking out, kept calling attention to the problems, and kept fighting for player safety even when it cost her thousands of dollars. The most disturbing part of this whole pattern was how predictable it had become. Sophie would point out a dangerous trend in officiating, get fined for speaking up, and then watch as her predictions came true with devastating consequences. The cycle was repeating itself over and over again, but the WNBA refused to acknowledge their role in creating this toxic environment. As Sophie lay on that court with her torn MCL, every single one of those fines must have felt like a slap in the face. She tried to warn everyone about exactly this type of scenario, paid thousands of dollars in penalties for speaking up, and still ended up becoming a victim of the very system she'd been fighting against. But what she did next would prove that the WNBA had messed with the wrong person. When Sophie's sister Lindsay saw what happened to her sibling, she wasn't about to stay quiet. What she posted next would trigger a chain of events that nobody saw coming, and it would lead to one of the most savage clapbacks in sports history. Lindsay Cunningham didn't hold back. She went straight for the WNBA's throat with a post that called out their pathetic officiating and demanded they focus less on fining players for speaking truth and more on hiring referees who could actually protect athletes. Her message was raw, emotional, and absolutely devastating. She wasn't just defending her sister, she was declaring war on an entire system that had failed Sophie when she needed protection most. The post went viral instantly. Thousands of fans were sharing it, commenting their support, and adding their own stories about the WNBA's corrupt officiating. For the first time, people were seeing the real cost of the league's negligence through the eyes of a family member who watched her sister's career get destroyed by preventable circumstances. But that's when the real ugliness started to show. The same toxic fans who had been celebrating Sophie's injury began targeting Lindsay's post with vicious comments. These weren't just random trolls, these were people who had been waiting for this moment to kick the Cunningham family while they were down. The attacks were personal, nasty, and designed to cause maximum emotional damage during an already devastating time. Lindsay was getting attacked for defending her injured sister. Think about how twisted that is. A woman watches her sibling suffer a career-threatening injury due to negligent officiating, speaks out about it, and then gets bombarded with hate from cowards hiding behind anonymous accounts. The level of cruelty was absolutely disgusting, but it revealed everything you need to know about the toxic culture surrounding women's basketball. Sophie was watching all of this unfold from her hospital bed. She saw her sister getting dragged through the mud for having the courage to speak up when Sophie couldn't defend herself. She watched as the same people who had been coming after her for months now turned their attention to her family members, and that's when something snapped inside her. What happened next will go down as one of the most legendary moments in WNBA history. Sophie decided she wasn't going to let these cowards attack her family without consequences. She wasn't going to play the victim or take the high road. She was going to show everyone exactly who they were dealing with. Sophie's response was only 8 words long, but it packed the force of a nuclear weapon. Nuke us all around and find out. That was it. Simple, direct, and absolutely terrifying if you knew what Sophie was capable of when pushed too far. Those 8 words instantly became a rallying cry that sent shockwaves through the entire basketball community. The phrase went viral immediately. Fans started using it as their own battle cry against the toxic elements in women's basketball. It showed up on t-shirts, social media profiles, and became the unofficial motto for anyone who was tired of watching players get mistreated by the system. Sophie had turned her moment of greatest vulnerability into a declaration of war. But this wasn't just some empty threat or tough talk for social media. Sophie was making a promise. She was telling everyone who had kicked her while she was down, everyone who had attacked her family, and everyone who had celebrated her injury that there would be consequences. The quiet, respectful Sophie who had been taking punishment from the league was gone forever. What made this moment so powerful was the timing. Sophie didn't wait until she was healthy or back on the court to respond. She fired back while she was still dealing with the physical and emotional trauma of her injury. She showed incredible strength by refusing to let her attackers think they had broken her spirit or silenced her voice. The response from fans was absolutely incredible. Within hours, Sophie's Up Around and Find Out post had thousands of likes, shares, and comments from people who were inspired by her refusal to back down. Players from other teams started showing their support, and even people who weren't basketball fans began following the story because of Sophie's fierce response. Sophie had transformed from a victim into a warrior in the span of a few hours. She took the worst moment of her career and turned it into a defining statement about who she really was underneath all the injuries and setbacks. This wasn't the same player who had been quietly accepting fines from the WNBA. This was someone who had decided to fight back with everything she had. The beauty of Sophie's response was how it completely flipped the script. Instead of people focusing on her injury or feeling sorry for her, they were now talking about her strength and courage. She had taken control of the narrative and shown everyone that she wasn't going to be defined by what happened to her on that court. Her attackers had expected to break her down when she was at her lowest point. Instead, they had awakened something fierce inside Sophie that nobody had seen before. The woman who had been fined for speaking up about referee incompetence was now ready to take on anyone who wanted to test her resolve. But what nobody expected was what Sophie would reveal next. Just when everyone thought they understood the situation, she was about to drop a truth bomb that would completely change how people saw this entire controversy. The real story was far more complicated than anyone realized, and Sophie's next move would leave everyone speechless.
What Sophie Cunningham said next completely destroyed everything people thought they knew about this situation. In a move that nobody saw coming, she went on her podcast and did something that left the entire basketball world speechless. She defended Bria Hartley.
That's right. The same Sophie who had just told her haters to F around and find out was now telling everyone to stop attacking the player who had ended her season. The plot twist was so unexpected that even her biggest supporters didn't know what to think. But Sophie's reasoning revealed something far more sinister about the WNBA that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Sophie dropped bombshell after bombshell during that podcast episode. She revealed that she and Bria Hartley were actually close friends off the court. She explained that there was no way Bria would intentionally try to hurt her because they had a genuine relationship built on mutual respect. Sophie even admitted that she had to tell her own mother to delete harsh posts about Hartley because she knew the collision was just an unfortunate basketball play. The revelation was mind-blowing. Fans had spent weeks calling Bria Hartley a dirty player and demanding she face consequences for ending Sophie's season. Social media had been filled with conspiracy theories about intentional targeting and deliberate attempts to injure Sophie. But now Sophie herself was saying that everyone had gotten it completely wrong. But here's where Sophie's masterstroke became clear. By defending Hartley, she was actually exposing the real villain in this entire situation. It wasn't about one player making a dirty play, it was about a systemic failure by the WNBA to create an environment where these kinds of dangerous collisions were even possible in the first place. Sophie explained that the collision happened because referees had been letting players get away with increasingly aggressive play all season long. Without proper enforcement of safety rules, players were being forced to make split-second decisions in chaotic situations that the officials should never have allowed to develop. Bria wasn't a villain, she was just another victim of the league's negligent officiating standard. The genius of Sophie's strategy became crystal clear. Instead of letting the WNBA hide behind the narrative that this was just an isolated incident between two players, she was forcing everyone to confront the real problem. The league had created a culture where dangerous plays were normalized, and now they were trying to escape accountability by letting individual players take the blame. Sophie's defense of Hartley also revealed something beautiful about her character. Even while dealing with a career-threatening injury and facing attacks from toxic fans, she refused to let an innocent person become a scapegoat for the WNBA's failures. She was willing to redirect anger away from her friend and toward the system that had failed both of them. But Sophie wasn't done dropping truth bombs. She went on to expose how the league's priorities were completely backwards. They had unlimited resources to monitor players' social media accounts and issue fines for criticism, but somehow couldn't find the money to properly train referees or implement basic safety protocols that would prevent these kinds of injuries. The contrast was absolutely damning. Sophie had been fined $1,500 for pointing out referee incompetence on her podcast, but the officials who allowed the dangerous play that ended her season faced zero consequences. The league had more accountability measures for players who spoke out than for the people whose job it was to keep those same players safe. Sophie's revelation about her friendship with Bria also highlighted another disturbing aspect of the WNBA's culture. The toxic fans who had been celebrating Sophie's injury and attacking her family weren't just random trolls, they were people who had been conditioned by the league's own behavior to think this kind of cruelty was acceptable. When the WNBA systematically punishes players for speaking up while ignoring dangerous officiating, they're sending a message that player welfare isn't important. When they fine someone for criticizing referees but don't fine referees for missing calls that cause injuries, they're creating a culture where violence and negligence are more acceptable than honesty and accountability. Sophie's willingness to defend Bria while simultaneously calling out the real problems showed incredible maturity and strategic thinking. She understood that the individual players weren't the enemy, they were all victims of a system that prioritized profit over safety and control over player welfare. The podcast episode completely changed the conversation around Sophie's injury. Instead of focusing on whether Bria Hartley was a dirty player, people started asking harder questions about why the WNBA's officiating had deteriorated to the point where these kinds of collisions were happening regularly. Sophie had successfully redirected the anger toward the people who actually deserved it. But perhaps most importantly, Sophie had shown that her F around and find out warning wasn't directed at Bria Hartley or even the toxic fans who had attacked her family. It was a message to the WNBA itself. She was telling the league that she wasn't going to let them use individual players as scapegoats for their systemic failures anymore. Sophie Cunningham had turned what could have been a career-ending injury into a platform for exposing the truth about women's basketball's biggest problems. She had shown that even from a hospital bed, she was more powerful than the officials who had failed to protect her. And most importantly, she had proven that sometimes the most devastating response isn't revenge, it's simply telling the truth that everyone else is too afraid to speak. The WNBA thought they could silence Sophie with fines and intimidation. Instead, they had created their most effective critic and given her the perfect platform to expose everything that was wrong with their organization. Sophie's injury was tragic, but her response to it might just be the catalyst that finally forces real change in women's basketball, and that would be the greatest victory of all.